At 72, I lay in a hospital bed with an IV drip in my arm, and my three children stood beside me, not to hold my hand, but to place a piece of paper in my hand to sign. That was the moment I realized the people I gave birth to, raised, sacrificed my whole life for, were not here for love. They were here for the money. If you want to know what a 72-year-old mother did to reclaim her life, subscribe to the channel now, like this video, and comment the city or country you're watching from so I know how far my story has come. Don't go anywhere, this story isn't over yet. I used to think that if you loved your children hard enough, long enough, and selflessly enough, they would never turn against you. I used to believe that the sacrifices a mother makes, the sleepless nights, the years of going without, the quiet ways you chip away at your own life to build something better for the people you brought into the world. I believed all of that created a bond that nothing could break. I was wrong, and it took lying in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm and a legal document sliding across the blanket toward my hand for me to finally understand what I had been too blind or maybe too hopeful to see. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 72 years old, and this is the story of how the three children I raised, loved, and gave everything to tried to take the last thing I had left. But it is also the story of how I stopped them. I need to take you back. Not to the hospital, not yet. Because what happened in that room only makes sense if you understand what came before it. The decades that led to that single moment, that single sheet of paper, that single pen. My husband, Gerald, died 23 years ago. Heart attack. He was 54 years old, and we had been married for 31 years, and I still remember the phone call like it was this morning. I was standing in the kitchen cutting apples, and the phone rang, and when I hung up, I sat down on the floor and didn't get up for a very long time. We had built our life in a small town called Mill Haven, about 40 minutes outside of Portland. Gerald was a contractor. I taught elementary school for 18 years. We weren't wealthy. We were stable, which in my experience is something far more valuable and far more fragile. When Gerald died, I was 49 years old, with three children, a modest life insurance payout, and a parcel of land that Gerald had purchased years earlier with the dream of doing something with it someday. He never specified what. He just used to say, "Clara, that land is going to matter to someone. Maybe not us, but someone." I held on to that land like I was holding on to him. For 3 years after Gerald died, I barely functioned. I went through the motions. I fed the kids, I showed up to work, I kept the house from falling apart. But grief is a strange thing. It hollows you out in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. You can look perfectly fine to the world and still feel like there's nothing solid underneath you anymore. My children were teenagers when Gerald passed. Nathan was 18, Olivia was 16, Sophie was 14. They were old enough to understand what loss meant, but young enough that they still needed a mother who could hold it together. So I held it together. I held it together for years. Long after I should have been allowed to fall apart, I kept myself upright for them. And then, one afternoon, about 3 years after Gerald died, I drove out to that piece of land and I just sat there. Sat in the car, engine off, and looked at what Gerald had seen in this place. A creek running along the back edge. Old oak trees. A long field that caught the afternoon light in a way that was almost painful to look at. I don't know when the idea came to me exactly, but I drove home that night with something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. I researched for months. I talked to lawyers, to nonprofit consultants, to women in my community. I learned about something called a retreat sanctuary, a residential space for women going through crisis, domestic abuse survivors, women rebuilding after divorce, mothers who had lost children, women who had simply collapsed under the weight of their own lives and needed somewhere safe to catch their breath. That land became Havenbrook Sanctuary. It took me 4 years to build it. I used Gerald's life insurance money, a small business loan, and every dollar I had saved over a decade of teaching. I fundraised at church basements and community halls. I wrote grants until my fingers cramped. I hired contractors, filed permits, fought city councils who thought a women's retreat was a liability they didn't want in their jurisdiction. But I built it, and once I built it, I ran it. By the time I was in my late 60s, Havenbrook had served over 1,100 women. We had a full-time staff of 7, a rotating team of counselors, and a waiting list that never seemed to shorten no matter how hard we worked. We had expanded the original structure twice. We had a small lake, a garden that our guests tended themselves, and a community room where women sat together on Tuesday evenings and talked about what they were going to do next with their lives. That place was not just something I built. It was who I had become after Gerald died. It was the thing I had made from my grief. Now, my children. I want to be fair to them, because even after everything that happened, I still believe in being fair. Nathan is 41 years old. He is the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately starts calculating how everything in it could be of use to him. I noticed that quality in him when he was a teenager, and I told myself it was ambition. Maybe I should have called it something else. He works in commercial real estate. He is good at it. He married a woman named Denise who is pleasant and careful and always seems faintly relieved when she can leave a room. They have 2 children. Nathan has never once in his adult life asked me how I was doing without immediately pivoting to something he needed from me. Olivia is 39. She is the one who always knew how to make me feel guilty without ever doing anything you could specifically point to. She was my middle child, and she spent most of her childhood feeling invisible between her louder older brother and her youngest sister who arrived and immediately demanded the world's attention. I understood Olivia's wounds. I tried to address them for decades. But somewhere along the way, Olivia learned that her wounds gave her power, that she could deploy them like a weapon whenever she needed the room to tilt in her direction. She divorced twice. She lived in 3 different cities. She always came back to Millhaven when she needed something, and always left again once she had it. Sophie is 37. Sophie was my complicated one. She was the most tender-hearted child, genuinely warm, genuinely caring, the one who would find injured birds in the yard and carry them inside and weep when they didn't survive. But Sophie was also the most easily influenced person I have ever known. She could be led anywhere by whoever was loudest in the room. She never developed a spine she could call her own. And as her siblings got older and sharper and more ruthless, Sophie became the thing they leaned on. Not for support, but to absorb the weight of their choices without pushing back. I loved all 3 of them. I want to be clear about that. But I also knew them. And knowing them, truly knowing them, meant knowing what they were capable of. I got sick the spring before last. It started with fatigue, then shortness of breath, then a night where I woke up and the room was spinning in a way that wasn't dizziness. It was something deeper, something mechanical failing. I drove myself to the clinic the next morning, which my doctor later told me I absolutely should not have done. And after 3 days of tests, they told me I had a serious cardiac condition. Not immediately life-threatening if managed properly, but serious, requiring surgery, medication, significant lifestyle changes. I was 68 when Gerald died of a heart attack. I was 72 when I learned my own heart was failing. I sat in that doctor's office and I thought about Gerald. I thought about the land he bought with a dream attached to it. I thought about the 1,100 women who had walked through Havenbrook's doors. And I made a decision, right there in that room, before I even called my children to tell them I was ill. I was not going to let what happened to Havenbrook be decided by grief or guilt or whoever got to me first. I called my attorney, a woman named Victoria Hayes, the following week. Victoria had been my lawyer for 15 years. She was methodical and direct, and she did not waste words or emotions. I explained what I wanted. She listened without interrupting, which is a quality I deeply respect in a person. "You want to protect the foundation," she said when I finished. "I want to make it impossible to dismantle," I said. "I want it to be clear that Havenbrook is not an asset. It is not an inheritance. It is not something that can be sold, subdivided, leveraged, or transferred to any individual, including my children, especially my children." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Clara, have they said something to you?" "No," I said, "but I know my children." We spent 2 months restructuring the legal foundation of Havenbrook, converting it into a protected community trust with an independent board of directors, a charitable mandate that could not be altered without approval from 3 separate legal bodies, and a clause that explicitly prevented any family member from serving on the board or benefiting financially from the organization in any capacity. I signed those documents in Victoria's office on a Thursday afternoon in March. 3 weeks later, I collapsed in my kitchen. I woke up in the ICU with an oxygen mask over my face and a nurse named Patricia adjusting something on the monitor beside my bed. The light in the room was the pale, watery kind that hospitals always seem to have, like the sun is apologizing for being there. Mrs. Whitmore, Patricia said when she saw my eyes open. Don't try to sit up. You're okay. You're at Millhaven General. You came in last night. Last night. I tried to piece it together, the kitchen, the floor coming up toward me, and then nothing. My friend, I said, and my voice came out wrong, scraped and thin. Marianne, is she? She's the one who found you, Patricia said. She's in the waiting room. She's been here since 2 a.m. Marianne Cole. She and I had been friends for 34 years since our children were in elementary school together. She was the person who had come to my house the night Gerald died and sat on the kitchen floor with me without saying a single word because she understood, somehow, that words would have been exactly the wrong thing. She was the kind of friend that you spend your whole life hoping to find, and most people never do. And my children? I asked. Patricia adjusted something on my IV line and didn't quite meet my eyes. They've been notified. That pause. That careful non-answer. I noted it. I spent the first day drifting in and out. The medication was heavy, and the cardiac event had exhausted every cell in my body. I heard Marianne's voice at some point, felt her hand covering mine. I heard a doctor's voice explaining something in low, measured tones. And then, sometime in the afternoon of the second day, I heard Nathan's voice. He was in the hallway, just outside my room. He didn't know the door was not fully closed, or maybe he didn't care. The timing works, he was saying. She can't manage Havenbrook from a hospital bed. If we move now, before she's back on her feet, I couldn't hear who he was speaking to. But I didn't need to. I lay in that bed, with the oxygen still running and the monitors clicking their quiet rhythm beside me. And I felt something happen inside me that wasn't physical at all. Something broke open. Not broke down, not broke apart. Broke open. Like a locked room. I had been afraid to enter for years, and the door had finally come off its hinges. I pressed the call button for Patricia and asked her, when she came, to please make sure my room door was kept fully closed. Then I lay there in the blue-white hospital light, and I started thinking very clearly. They came to my room the following morning, Nathan, Olivia, and Sophie. Nathan came in first, the way he always did everywhere, like he was leading a delegation. He was wearing a gray blazer that he always put on when he was trying to project authority. I had given him that blazer for his birthday 3 years ago. I noticed I was noticing that. Mom. He leaned down and kissed my forehead in the careful way you kiss someone you're not sure you want to get close to. How are you feeling? Tired, I said. You gave us a real scare. He pulled the chair beside my bed and sat down. The chair closest to me, the chair that established presence, control over the space. Nathan always understood space. Olivia came in behind him and stood near the window. She had been crying, or had arranged her face to suggest she had been. Her eyes were soft and wet around the edges. Mom, I'm so relieved you're okay. She didn't come close enough to touch me. Sophie came in last and went straight to the other side of my bed and took my hand. Her grip was too tight, the grip of someone who was frightened and also guilty and didn't know what to do with either feeling. Hi, baby, I said to her. Sophie's eyes filled up immediately. I was so scared, Mom. I know, I said. Nathan cleared his throat, the sound of a man trying to move an agenda forward. So, listen, he said. The doctors briefed us this morning. It sounds like recovery is going to take some time, weeks, probably. Maybe longer. He paused. And we've been thinking, all three of us, about what that means, for you, obviously, but also for Havenbrook. There it was. 48 hours after I had been brought into an ICU. 48 hours. Have you? I said. We just think it makes sense to have a plan in place, Olivia said from the window. Her voice had that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable, smooth and measured, like something rehearsed. Someone who can step in and make decisions for Havenbrook while you're recovering, just to make sure things keep running. Someone, I said. Like who? Nathan reached down beside his chair and lifted a folder I hadn't noticed him bring in. He set it on the edge of my bed and opened it. Inside were several pages of dense legal text. It's a temporary power of attorney, he said. Limited scope. Just to cover operational decisions for the sanctuary while you're incapacitated. I'm not incapacitated, Nathan. Mom, I am in a hospital bed with a cardiac condition. That is not the same thing as being incapacitated. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Nathan's expression didn't change. That was the thing about Nathan. He didn't break composure easily. He just recalibrated. It's just a precaution, he said, so that you don't have to worry, so you can focus on getting better without, put the folder away. Mom, just read it. I said put the folder away. Sophie made a small sound beside me. Her hand loosened on mine. Nathan looked at me for a long moment. Then he closed the folder and set it on his knee instead of putting it away. We're just trying to help, Olivia said from the window. But the smoothness was gone from her voice now. There was something underneath it, an edge. I know what you're trying to do, I said. Mom. Nathan leaned forward. His voice dropped, not quiet with tenderness, but quiet with the kind of pressure that wants you to feel it. You need to think practically about this. You almost died. You can't manage a nonprofit from an ICU. If something happens, if there are decisions that need to be made, Victoria Hayes is my attorney, I said. Her number is in my phone. She has authority over anything that requires immediate legal decision-making. I arranged this before I ever came into this hospital. That surprised him. He hadn't expected that. For just a fraction of a second, the composure slipped. A small tightening around his eyes, a faint shift in his jaw. You talked to your attorney, he said slowly. I've been talking to my attorney for months, I said. Havenbrook is protected, Nathan. It cannot be transferred, managed, redirected, or leveraged by anyone outside its board structure. That includes family members. That specifically includes the three of you. Sophie made another sound. This one was something between a breath and a word. Olivia had gone very still at the window. Nathan said nothing for a long moment. Then he picked up the folder, stood up, and buttoned his blazer. You need to rest, he said, the tone of a man who is retreating but not surrendering. He walked out. Olivia followed without looking at me. Sophie stayed for just a moment. She was looking at me with the expression of a person who has just watched two realities collide and doesn't know which one to live in anymore. Mom, she said, but she didn't finish the sentence. It's okay, Sophie, I said, and I meant something by that, though I wasn't sure yet exactly what. She squeezed my hand once, then she let go and left. I lay back against the hospital pillow and stared at the ceiling. Outside in the corridor, I could hear Nathan's voice, low, rapid, controlled, speaking to someone on his phone. I closed my eyes. I was tired. I was in a hospital bed at 72 years old, and my heart had decided to stage a protest, and my children had just walked into my ICU room carrying legal documents. But I was not afraid. I had been afraid of this moment for years, afraid of exactly what my children might do when they smelled vulnerability, afraid of what grief and illness and old age would expose me to. But lying there with the monitors clicking beside me and Nathan's voice filtering through the closed door, I realized something important. I had already moved first, and they had walked into my hospital room not knowing that. That folder on Nathan's knee had meant nothing. Those signatures they had come to collect would have meant nothing. Havenbrook was protected. My legal affairs were in order. Victoria Hayes had a copy of every relevant document, and she had my specific instructions for exactly this scenario. They had come expecting to find a frightened old woman. What they found instead was a woman who had spent the last several months making sure they couldn't do what they had just tried to do. I reached for the call button. Patricia, I said when she appeared, could you ask Marianne to come in? And could you make sure that door is locked this time? Patricia looked at me for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite a smile but was in that direction. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore, she said. Marianne stayed with me for 2 hours that afternoon. She didn't ask me what had happened with my children, because Marianne has always had the particular wisdom of knowing when not to ask. She sat in the chair beside my bed and she talked to me about small things. About the garden at Havenbrook. About a robin that had built a nest in the eaves above the sanctuary's front porch. About the Tuesday evening group that had apparently continued meeting in my absence because the women didn't want to stop. She talked, and I listened, and the talking filled the room with something that wasn't grief or anger or fear, and that was exactly what I needed. But when the small talk ran out and the room got quiet, Marianne looked at me with the particular directness she had always possessed, the kind that doesn't blink and doesn't soften itself unnecessarily. And she said, Tell me what Nathan said. So I told her. I told her about the folder, about the power of attorney, about Olivia at the window with her carefully arranged wet eyes, about Sophie's hand on mine and the sound she made when I said Victoria's name, and watched Nathan's composure crack at the edges. Marianne listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How long do you think they've been planning it?" "I don't know," I said, "but it wasn't spontaneous. That paperwork was prepared. You don't walk into your mother's ICU room with a drafted power of attorney document 48 hours after her cardiac event, unless someone made a phone call to a lawyer before they even got on the road to come here." Marianne's expression did something complicated. She had known my children since they were small. She had watched Nathan play Little League and helped me sew Olivia's Halloween costume one year when I ran out of time. She had been at Sophie's kindergarten graduation. Whatever she felt about what I was telling her, it sat on her face for just a moment before she put it away. "What do you need from me?" she said. That was Marianne. Not "what are you going to do?" Not "can you believe them?" Not "I always knew Nathan was," just "what do you need?" "I need you to go to my house," I said. "There's a fireproof lockbox in the bottom of the closet in my bedroom, behind the winter coats. The combination is Gerald's birthday. Inside there are copies of every document Victoria and I filed over the last 2 months. Bring them to me." "Okay." "And Marianne," I paused, "don't tell anyone you're going, don't tell the kids, don't answer questions if they call you." She looked at me steadily. "Clara, do you think they'd go to your house?" I thought about Nathan in the hallway outside my room, his voice low and rapid and controlled, calling someone. I thought about Olivia, who had always understood that the way you won a fight was not by confronting someone directly, but by quietly removing their options before they knew options were being removed. I thought about the property records, the financial filings, the organizational documents for Havenbrook that lived in files in my home office. "Yes," I said. "I think there's a real possibility." Marianne stood up. She picked up her purse and her keys and her light jacket, and she looked at me with an expression that was something between determination and a very old, very tired sadness. "I'll call you when I'm there," she said. She left. And I lay in the hospital bed and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about my children. I thought about Nathan, at 18 years old, sitting across from me at the kitchen table the week after Gerald's funeral, eating a bowl of cereal and asking me whether Dad had left a will. He had been 18. He had just lost his father. And the third thing out of his mouth, 3 days after the burial, was the will. I had told myself at the time that it was how he processed grief, by organizing, by establishing structure, by needing to understand the practical shape of the world that had just been upended. I had given him every benefit of every doubt I had available. I wondered now, lying in that hospital room, how many of those doubts I should have kept. I thought about Olivia at 32, calling me from Seattle during her second divorce to tell me that she needed money. Not asking, telling. Telling me in the tone of a person who has decided the conversation is already settled and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. I had sent the money. Of course I had sent the money. She was my daughter, and she was in trouble, and that's what you do. But I also remembered the way the call ended. Not with "thank you," not with "I love you," but with a kind of brisk efficiency, as if once the transaction was completed, the call no longer served a purpose. And Sophie, sweet, tender, easily led Sophie, who had stood at my bedside with her grip too tight and her eyes too full, and who had left the room behind her brother and sister without once looking back. The thing about loving your children is that it doesn't stop. Even when it should probably pause to have a conversation with your self-preservation instinct, the love doesn't actually stop. It just becomes more painful. It becomes something you carry like a stone in your chest, heavy, always present, and starting to do damage. Marianne called me at 4:30 that afternoon. "I'm at the house," she said. Her voice was careful, measured in a way that immediately told me something was wrong. "What is it?" "Clara, someone has been in your office." I felt the cold go through me before I even fully processed the words. "What do you mean, been in my office?" "The filing cabinet is open, the top 2 drawers. Papers have been moved. I can tell because you always organize your files a certain way, and some of the folders are out of order. Nothing looks like it's missing, but someone has gone through them." I closed my eyes. "The lockbox?" Still there. Combination still works. Everything inside is intact. The Havenbrook files in the bottom drawer of the desk? A pause. That drawer is open. The folders are there, but they've been handled. The tabs are facing the wrong direction. You always put them facing right. These are facing left. Someone had been in my house, in my office, going through my files. While I was in an ICU. While I was sedated and monitored and lying in a hospital bed with tubes in my arm. I sat with that for a moment. I let it be exactly as large and ugly as it was. "Marianne," I said, "take the lockbox. Take it to your house tonight. Don't leave it at mine. Already in my car. And take photographs of the filing cabinet, the desk drawer, everything exactly as you found it. Date stamp them if you can." "Clara," her voice softened slightly. "Are you going to call Victoria?" "Tonight," I said. "Yes." I called Victoria Hayes at 5 o'clock that evening. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she had been expecting my call, which meant she had possibly already heard something, which meant this situation was already moving faster than I had fully realized. "Clara," she said, "I've been trying to reach you. I got a call this afternoon from someone identifying themselves as representing the Whitmore family estate. They were asking questions about Havenbrook's legal structure." I felt the cold again, deeper this time. "Who called you?" "A lawyer named Garrett Paulson. Do you know him?" "No?" "He's a probate and estate attorney. He has offices in Portland. He was asking specifically about the board structure of the foundation, who holds decision-making authority, whether there are any provisions in the charter that allow for emergency family oversight." Victoria paused. "Clara, he seemed very well informed about Havenbrook's general structure. Someone had briefed him." "Nathan." It was Nathan. Nathan, who had walked out of my hospital room with the folder and the button blazer and made a phone call in the hallway. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him that the Havenbrook Community Foundation is a legally independent entity, that its charter is a matter of public record, and that any questions about its governance structure should be directed to the board of directors." Another pause. "And then I told him that I represent Clara Whitmore personally, and that any further communication regarding her personal legal affairs should come through me." "Good. Clara, I need you to hear me on something. What they're doing, bringing in outside legal counsel, researching the foundation structure, entering your home." She stopped. "That last one troubles me most. If someone entered your home without your permission and handled your personal documents, that is not a gray area. That is potentially criminal." "I know," I said. "Do you know for certain it was one of the children?" "I know I was admitted to the hospital 2 days ago, and my house has been accessed, and my files have been reviewed. I know my children were aware I was hospitalized. I know my son spent 30 seconds looking at me in a hospital bed before he started talking about Havenbrook." I pressed my fingers against the bridge of my nose. My head was beginning to ache. "Who else would it be, Victoria?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to make some calls tonight. I want you to rest. I want you to let Patricia and the medical team do their job. And I want you to promise me that if Nathan or either of your daughters comes back to that hospital room with any kind of document, you will immediately call me. Not after, not when you've had time to think about it. Immediately." "I promise," I said. "And Clara, don't sign anything. Not a consent form, not a visitor log addendum, nothing you haven't read completely and discussed with me first." "Victoria, I'm not signing anything." "Good." A beat of quiet. "How are you feeling? Medically, I mean. How's your heart?" I thought about that. About the actual physical heart inside my chest. The one that had sent me to the floor of my kitchen. The one that was being monitored by machines. The one that was apparently struggling with things I had not entirely accepted yet. "It's tired," I said honestly. "Rest it," she said. "Save the fight for when you're standing up." She hung up. I set the phone down on the blanket and looked at the ceiling of my hospital room. The light outside the window had gone amber with evening. Somewhere down the corridor, I could hear the quiet sounds of a hospital settling into its nighttime rhythms. I thought about Garrett Paulson, probate attorney, Portland. Someone had briefed him. I thought about my upended filing cabinet, my desk drawer standing open with the folder tabs facing the wrong direction. I thought about Nathan buttoning his blazer and walking out of my room with an expression like a door that had been closed but not latched. I was angry. "I want to tell you that plainly, because I think sometimes when women are angry, especially older women, especially mothers, the anger gets translated into something softer or something more acceptable, something like hurt or worry or sadness. And those things were also true. But the primary thing I felt that evening, alone in my hospital room with the amber light fading outside the window, was anger, clear and focused and cold. Not the hot kind of anger that makes you say things you'll regret. The quiet kind. The kind that settles into your bones and becomes something you can use. I had given those three people everything I had. Not metaphorically, literally. I had given them 37 years of my daily, active, conscious attention. I had given them summers and holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday nights and countless hours of sitting with them through things that were painful and things that were boring and things that were funny and things that broke my heart. I had given them the money from their father's life insurance when they needed it. I had driven long distances to be present for things they told me mattered to them. I had folded myself into the shape of whatever each of them needed at any given time, for decades, without stopping to ask very often whether what I was giving was actually being received or whether it was simply being consumed. And now I was lying in a hospital bed with a compromised heart, and the three of them had arrived with a lawyer's paperwork and sent their own attorney to interrogate my legal representation and walked through my house and handled my private files. There's a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name. It's not loss. Not exactly. It's the grief you feel when you finally see something clearly that you spent years working very hard not to see. When the version of reality you've been maintaining through sheer effort collapses, and you're left with what was actually true the whole time. I had been working very hard, for decades, not to see my children as clearly as I actually saw them. That night, I stopped working so hard, I didn't sleep well. My mind kept turning things over. Specific moments, specific conversations, things that had seemed like isolated incidents at the time, and now were arranging themselves into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Nathan asking about Gerald's will 3 days after the funeral. Olivia calling for money without asking. Sophie's hand loosening on mine when I said Victoria's name. Little things, dozens of little things that I had filed under the charitable interpretation because I loved them, and love makes you a bad archivist. In the morning, I asked Patricia for a notebook and a pen. She looked at me with the specific mild alarm of a nurse whose patient is trying to do something that isn't resting. Just writing, I told her, just organizing my thoughts. She brought me the notebook. I spent 2 hours writing down every specific incident I could remember, dates where possible, approximate time frames otherwise. Things Nathan had said about Havenbrook over the years. A conversation with Olivia 4 years earlier when she had asked, almost casually, whether I had updated my will recently. The time Sophie had mentioned, also casually, that a friend of hers had told her about a company that managed nonprofit transitions. Small things, all of them small things. But I was done treating small things as small. 2 days later, Nathan came back. He came alone this time. No Olivia by the window, no Sophie with the too tight grip. Just Nathan, in a different blazer, dark blue this time, and with a different expression. Not the controlled authority of the first visit. Something more careful, more calibrated. He sat down without being asked, and he looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "I want to apologize," he said. I waited. "The way we came at you the other day, that wasn't right. You were barely out of the ICU and we walked in there with paperwork. That was bad judgment." He had the tone of a man who has practiced this, who has rehearsed the exact texture of sincerity. "I want you to know that we care about you, Mom. We're worried. That's all this has ever been." "Nathan," I said, "who is Garrett Paulson?" The practiced expression flickered, just for a half second. "What?" "Garrett Paulson, probate attorney, Portland. He called my attorney 2 days ago asking about Havenbrook's legal structure. Someone briefed him on the foundation's general details before he made that call." I watched my son's face. "Was that you?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. The flicker was gone. The careful expression was back. But it had shifted slightly, from remorseful to something more neutral, more defended. "I was exploring options," he said, "to understand what the situation was." "What situation?" "Your situation. The medical situation. What happens to Havenbrook if—" He stopped. "If I die," I said. Mom, say it, Nathan. That's what you mean. What happens to Havenbrook if I die? He pressed his lips together. It's a legitimate question. It's a question that has a legal answer, I said, which Victoria Hayes has been managing for the last several months, which Garrett Paulson would have discovered if he had done any actual research instead of calling my attorney and asking her to brief him on my personal legal structure. I paused. And then there's my house. Something shifted in Nathan's posture. Subtle, barely perceptible, but I had been watching this man's body language for 41 years. I don't know what you mean, he said. Someone went through my home office while I was in the hospital, I said. The filing cabinet was accessed. The Havenbrook desk files were handled. Marianne Cole went to my house to retrieve something for me and found the office in a state that was not how I left it. Maybe you don't remember leaving it that way. You were in a medical crisis. Nathan, my voice was even, completely level. I want you to be very careful right now about what you say to me. He went quiet. I have been in this hospital for 5 days, I said. I have not been confused. I have not been incompetent. I have not been incapable of understanding exactly what has happened around me. And I want you to understand something very clearly. Every single thing that has occurred since I was admitted. The power of attorney visit, the call to my attorney, whatever happened in my office. I am aware of all of it. I have documented all of it. And Victoria Hayes is aware of all of it. The room was very quiet. Nathan looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not in 41 years of being his mother. I couldn't name it exactly. It was somewhere between recalculation and something that might, in a more honest person, have been shame. I'm trying to protect you, he said. But the certainty was gone from it. It sounded like something he'd said before and had now lost faith in. No, I said. You're trying to protect what you think you're entitled to. Those are not the same thing. He sat with that for a moment. I watched him sit with it. Then he stood up. He didn't button his blazer this time. He just stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets, looking at me from a slightly different angle than he usually did, almost as if he was seeing something he hadn't noticed before and wasn't sure what to do with it. We're going to talk about this, he said. When you're home. When you're better. I know we are, I said. He left. I wrote down the date and time and a summary of the conversation in my notebook. Every word I could remember, every shift in his expression, every pause. I was building something. I didn't know yet exactly what shape it would take, but I was building it. 3 days after Nathan's second visit, I was moved out of the ICU and into a regular cardiac care room, which meant I was stable enough to have more visitors, more phone calls, more access to my own life. Patricia came in on her last shift before her days off and said goodbye in the professionally warm way that good nurses say goodbye, and I thanked her more sincerely than she probably expected because she had been kind to me in the specific small ways that matter enormously when you are frightened and alone. Victoria came in person on a Thursday. She sat down, opened her own notebook, and we talked for 90 minutes. She laid out what she knew, what she suspected, what she could prove, and what she recommended. She was precise and unsentimental, and I found that deeply comforting. The call to my office is documented, she said. Paulson identified himself and his clients as the Whitmore family. That gives us a clear record. The issue with the house is harder. You'd need to establish that access was unauthorized, which requires demonstrating that no one had a key or had been given permission to enter. Nathan has a key, I said. I gave all 3 of them keys years ago, for emergencies. Victoria wrote something down. Then accessing the house isn't necessarily trespass, but going through your personal files without authorization is a different question. She looked up at me. Clara, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Has Nathan, or either of your daughters, ever expressed to you directly that they expect to inherit Havenbrook as property, as an asset, in concrete terms? I thought about it, really thought about it. Not in those words, I said slowly. Nathan has said things over the years about Havenbrook being a significant asset, about the property value, about what it represented in terms of financial weight, but he always framed it as concern, awareness of what I was managing. And since your diagnosis, before the hospitalization, I hesitated. There was a conversation about 6 months ago, Thanksgiving dinner at Nathan's house. Denise had made a turkey that was slightly too dry, and we had all made the effort to say otherwise. And after dinner, Nathan and I had sat in the living room while Denise and Sophie cleaned up, and Olivia made a phone call in the kitchen, and Nathan had said, I was trying to remember exactly, he had said something about making sure Havenbrook had a succession plan, that if something happened to me, the organization needed leadership that could keep it stable. He had suggested, in the tone of a man proposing something reasonable, that a family member on the board might provide continuity. I had changed the subject. Victoria, I said, I think they've been planning this for longer than I wanted to believe. She looked at me steadily. That's my read as well. What do I need to do? She turned a page in her notebook. Several things. First, we need to file a formal notification with the Havenbrook board, making them aware of any potential external pressure on the organization's governance. They should know what's happening so they can act accordingly if anyone approaches them directly. Second, I want to document the state of your home office formally. Get Marianne to provide a written statement about what she found, with the photographs. Third, and most importantly, she stopped, tapped her pen against the page. Clara, I need to know. Is there any version of this where you want to try to resolve it within the family first, before it becomes something more formal? I thought about Nathan's rehearsed apology, about Olivia's arranged grief, about Sophie's hand loosening. No, I said. I think that window closed when they walked into my ICU room with the power of attorney. Victoria nodded. Not with satisfaction, more like confirmation of something she'd expected but had needed to hear me say. Okay, she said. Then we document everything, we strengthen every protection around Havenbrook, and we wait to see what they do next, because I don't think they're finished. She was right. They weren't finished. Olivia called me 4 days later, on a Sunday evening. I was sitting up in bed eating hospital food that was trying very hard to be a chicken dish and mostly failing when my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. I answered. Hi, sweetheart, I said, because she was still my daughter, even now. Mom. Her voice was different from the hospital visit. Not the carefully managed emotion, not the smooth reasonableness. Something more raw, more genuine. Though with Olivia, I had learned to be careful about assuming genuine meant honest. Can we just talk? Not about the legal stuff. Not about Nathan's plans. Can we just talk? Okay, I said. There was a pause. And then she said something I wasn't prepared for. I don't think Nathan's doing this for the right reasons. I set down the chicken dish. Tell me what you mean. I mean, she stopped, exhaled. He's been talking to Denise's brother. Did you know that? Denise's brother is a developer, commercial real estate, and there have been conversations. I don't know how far along, I don't know what exactly was said, but there have been conversations about Havenbrook's property, about the land, what it could be worth if the sanctuary were… She stopped again. Redeveloped, I said. The word dropped into the silence between us like a stone into water. Olivia, I said carefully, are you telling me Nathan has been in conversations about selling or redeveloping Havenbrook's land? I'm telling you what I heard, she said. I'm not saying I know everything. I'm not saying I was in those conversations, but I heard enough to… She made a sound that in another context might have been a laugh. Mom, I came to that hospital thinking I was helping. Nathan made it sound like it was about taking care of you, about protection, and I wanted to believe that because it was easier than the other thing. What other thing? That he's been planning this for years, she said quietly. And I just went along with it because I always go along with things, and I'm so tired of being the person who goes along with things. I sat with that. The nighttime sounds of the hospital hummed gently around me. There was a version of this moment where I said, "Come to me. I forgive you. We'll fix this together." There was a version where I absorbed her pain and her guilt and made it easier for her to carry. But I was trying, very deliberately, to stop doing that. Olivia, I said, what you're telling me is important, and I hear you. I believe that what you're saying is true, but I need you to understand something. I chose my words carefully. Being sorry is not the same as making it right, and I love you. I will always love you, but I cannot pretend that walking into my hospital room with legal papers is something I can just let go of because you've changed your mind about whose side you're on. A long silence. I know, she said finally, very quietly. If you want to help me, really help me, I need you to tell me exactly what you heard, when you heard it, and who was in the conversation. Another silence, longer this time. Okay, she said. I'll tell you. And she did. She told me about a dinner at Nathan and Denise's house 8 months ago that she hadn't thought much of at the time. Denise's brother, a man named Paul Sutter, had been there. There had been wine and loose talk, and at some point the conversation had turned to Havenbrook, its location, its acreage, its proximity to a corridor where property development had been increasing steadily over the last decade. Paul had said something about the land being significantly underutilized. Nathan had said something about how that was a conversation for a different time. But the tone of the conversation, the way it had slid easily into that territory, the way Nathan had steered it rather than shut it down, had stayed with Olivia. She had told herself it was just talk, men with wine and real estate instincts. It didn't mean anything. But then he brought the papers to the hospital, she said, and I thought, this isn't just talk, this has been planned. I wrote everything down in my notebook after we hung up. The date, the dinner, Paul Sutter's name, every detail Olivia had given me. Then I called Victoria and left a message on her voicemail telling her to call me in the morning because I had new information. Then I lay back against the pillow and I stared at the ceiling for a very long time. Gerald had bought that land with the money we had scraped together over years of teaching and contracting and living carefully. He had seen something in it. Not profit. Gerald was never primarily interested in profit. He had seen potential for meaning, and I had taken that potential and built 11 years of actual meaning from it, built it from the ground up, built it from grief and purpose, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who has nothing to lose. And my son had been sitting at a dinner table 8 months ago, letting a developer talk about what the land could be worth. The anger I had been carrying since those first hours in the ICU sharpened. Not grew, sharpened. Became more precise, more focused, more useful. I was going to need it, because I was beginning to understand that what I was dealing with was not impulsive, was not opportunistic in the way that opportunism sometimes is, accidental, circumstantial, born of a sudden bad moment. This had been cultivated. This had been thought through. My son had been making plans quietly, carefully, in the background of family dinners and holiday gatherings, while I cooked and hosted and loved them, and believed that was enough. The next morning, the doctor came in and told me I was progressing well enough that I could expect to go home within the week. I thanked him. I asked the right questions about medication and follow-up care and what I should and should not do in the first weeks after discharge. And when he left, I picked up my notebook and kept writing. I was not going home to rest. I was going home to finish what I had already started, and to make sure that when Nathan made his next move, I was ready for it in a way he had never once in his life thought to prepare for. Because here is what my son had never fully understood, despite 41 years of being in proximity to me. I had not built Havenbrook by being gentle. I had built it by being relentless, by refusing to accept the version of events that other people tried to hand me, by deciding, in a parking lot outside a piece of land with a creek running along its edge, that the story wasn't over yet. He had made the mistake of thinking that because I was 72 and ill and lying in a hospital bed, the story was close enough to over that he could start writing the ending himself. He was wrong. And in the days ahead, I was going to show him exactly how wrong he was. They discharged me on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Marianne had found me on my kitchen floor. The doctor, a careful, precise man named Dr. Ellison, who had the manner of someone who had learned to deliver difficult information without flinching, sat with me for 30 minutes before I left and walked me through what the next several months needed to look like. Medication twice daily. No significant physical exertion for the first 6 weeks. Follow-up appointments every 3 weeks. He used the word manageable several times, which I understood was his way of telling me that the situation was serious enough to require that word. I listened. I asked questions. I wrote down what he said in the same notebook where I had been documenting my children's actions for the past week and a half, which seemed, in that moment, like an appropriate use of the same pages. Marianne drove me home. She didn't try to make conversation on the way, which I appreciated. The late October morning was cold and pale, the trees along the road mostly stripped of their leaves, and I watched them go by through the passenger window and let myself simply be in the motion of returning to my own life. When we pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The house looked exactly as it always did. The gray clapboard siding, the porch with the 2 rocking chairs. Gerald had built the summer before he got sick, the overgrown rose bush along the front walk that I kept meaning to properly prune and never quite got to. It looked the same, but I knew that inside, in my office, there were filing cabinet drawers that had been opened by hands that weren't mine, and that knowledge sat on the house like a shadow. "You okay?" Marianne asked. "I'll tell you when I know," I said, and got out of the car. She stayed with me for the rest of the day. She made soup. Actual soup, not the canned kind, the kind that requires chopping and time. And we sat at my kitchen table and ate it and talked about practical things. What I needed from the pharmacy. Whether my neighbor's son could clear the gutters before the winter rain started, since I wasn't supposed to be climbing ladders. The Tuesday evening group at Havenbrook, which Marianne had quietly helped keep running in my absence. She did not ask me what I was going to do about my children. She had learned, over 34 years, when to ask and when to let a thing breathe. After she left at 6 o'clock, I went to my office. I stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. The room was exactly as Marianne had described it in her formal written statement, which she had given to Victoria, 3 pages, clear and specific and dated. The filing cabinet drawers were back as I had left them now, because Marianne had documented and then carefully closed them. The desk was surface tidy, but I knew what had been disturbed, and knowing is different from seeing. Knowing gets underneath you. I sat down at my desk and I went through every file myself, slowly, methodically, not because I expected to find anything. Marianne hadn't already noted. She was thorough, and I trusted her completely, but because I needed to understand exactly what had been accessible, what information existed in those folders that my children, or whoever they had sent, had now seen. An hour later, I had a clear picture. The Havenbrook files that had been handled contained operational budgets from the last 3 fiscal years, staffing records, property maintenance logs. One folder held correspondence with the county about a zoning variance we had applied for 2 years earlier to expand the east wing of the sanctuary. Another held the original property deed, Gerald's name, then mine, then the transfer documentation to the Foundation Trust. The transfer documentation to the Foundation Trust. I stared at that folder for a long time. If Nathan had seen those papers, if whoever went through this office had read those documents, then they now knew that the transfer had been completed. They knew Havenbrook was already beyond their reach, which meant that when Nathan had come to the hospital with the power of attorney, he either hadn't known yet, or he had known and was hoping I hadn't fully secured it. I thought about the look on his face when I'd said Victoria's name, that small, fractional crack in the composure. He hadn't known, or he hadn't been sure. And coming back to search the house was how he'd found out. I picked up my phone and called Victoria. "I went through the office myself tonight," I told her. "The transfer documentation was in the files that were accessed. They know." "That's what I assumed," Victoria said. "Clara, I received a letter today. Formal correspondence from Garrett Paulson's office. They're contesting the validity of the foundation transfer." I set down the folder. "On what grounds?" "They're claiming you were not in full competent capacity at the time the transfer was executed. That your cardiac condition, which they're now claiming was more advanced than disclosed, affected your judgment." A pause. "They want a competency evaluation." The room was very quiet. "They're going to try to say I wasn't of sound mind when I protected Havenbrook," I said. "That's the argument. It has no merit. You were examined by your physician 3 weeks before we executed the transfer. You passed every cognitive assessment, and I have a witnessed, notarized record of our conversations. But it will require us to formally defend against it, which means time, legal process, and so..." She stopped. "Clara, I want to prepare you for the possibility that this gets uncomfortable, that they make claims about your mental and physical state that are upsetting to hear." "Let them," I said. I was surprised by how steady my voice was. "Let them say what they need to say. That's what courts are for." "You're sure you want to fight this?" "Victoria, I built a non-profit organization from raw land and a life insurance check while raising 3 children by myself and working a full-time job. I'm not frightened of Garrett Paulson." A beat of quiet. Then she said, "All right, I'll file our response Monday. In the meantime, I want you to sit tight, take your medication, and let me work." I agreed. I hung up. And then I sat at my desk in my office with the files arrayed around me, and I let myself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what was happening. My children were going to stand in front of a court and argue that their mother had been incompetent, that the woman who had run Havenbrook Sanctuary for over a decade, who had managed staff and budgets and county zoning boards and fundraising campaigns, who had executed a complex legal restructuring with her attorney and passed every cognitive assessment her physician had administered, that woman hadn't been capable of making her own decisions. They were going to do that. To me. To their mother. I stayed with that for a few minutes, felt how heavy it was, felt the particular shame of it. Not my shame, theirs, but the kind that splashes onto you anyway when it comes from people who are supposed to love you. Then I opened my notebook to a fresh page and started writing down everything Victoria had told me. I was not going to sit in that feeling and let it turn into paralysis. I had done that once before, in the 3 years after Gerald died, and I understood its contours well enough to know that the only way through it was movement, documentation, action, the stubborn, unsexy work of refusing to let the worst version of the story become the final one. The following morning, I drove myself to Havenbrook. Dr. Ellison had technically recommended I avoid driving for another week, but Havenbrook was 6 miles from my house on roads I had driven thousands of times. And I went slowly, and I got there without incident, and I sat in the parking lot for a moment looking at the building before going in. The sanctuary was a converted farmhouse that we had expanded twice. Once when I was 58, adding the east residential wing with 8 additional rooms, and once at 64 adding the community room and the covered porch that ran along the south side of the building. The original farmhouse still formed the heart of it. White clapboard, old windows that let in more cold than they should, floors that creaked in the particular welcoming way that old floors do. Around it, the ground spread out in a way I had always thought was beautiful without being showy. The garden the residents tended, the lake with its cattails and its terrible ducks that hissed at new arrivals but eventually came around, the path through the oaks that led to the back field. Gerald's land. My life. 1,100 women. I walked inside. The woman at the front desk was named Rosa. She had been with us for 6 years, a former Havenbrook resident herself who had returned first as a volunteer and then as our office coordinator. When she saw me come through the door, she came out from behind the desk and hugged me in the unself-conscious way of someone who isn't thinking about professional distance. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said into my shoulder. "We're so glad you're back." "I'm glad to be back," I said, and meant it in a way that was almost physical. A relief in my actual chest, which my cardiologist would probably have had notes about. I spent 2 hours at Havenbrook that morning. I walked the building. I checked in with the staff, my program director, Lenora, a composed and deeply competent woman who had been managing the sanctuary's day-to-day operations with steady professionalism since I'd been in the hospital. I sat in on the tail end of a morning session with 2 of the counselors and 3 residents, just observing, just being present in the room. I sat for a while in the community room after everyone left, just sitting in the quiet of it. The walls had photographs, women who had come through Havenbrook and agreed to share their images with us, faces arranged in the unguarded way of people who have survived something and know it. Some of them I could name. Some I had sat with personally, in this room, in other rooms, through hard nights and hard mornings, and the particular triumph of ordinary things. A woman who had been afraid to open a bank account in her own name learning to do it. A woman who hadn't driven a car in 8 years getting back behind the wheel. I looked at those photographs and I thought, this is what Nathan wants to sell. This is what Paul Sutter looked at and calculated in acres and development potential. This is what they had decided was available for the taking. That thought settled something in me. Not anger, something colder and more resolute. The thought had a quality to it like a door closing or a lock engaging, something that had been slightly uncertain, becoming entirely certain. When I got home, I set up a recording application on my phone, not for anything sinister. I did not plan to secretly record conversations with my children, but I wanted to be prepared. I wanted the ability to document, in real time if necessary, what was being said to me. I had been taking notes after the fact. I wanted more than notes. I called the Havenbrook board chair, a retired judge named Walter Bream, and asked him to schedule an emergency board meeting for the following week. I told him there had been a legal challenge to the foundation structure and that the board needed to be informed and prepared. Walter listened, asked 3 precise questions, and said he would have invitations out by end of day. Then 4 days after I came home from the hospital, Nathan came to the house. I had expected him to call first. That had been his pattern. The hospital visits had been announced, choreographed, controlled. But he showed up unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon and rang the doorbell in the particular way that suggests the person on the other side of it has rehearsed the moment. I looked through the window before opening the door. He was alone. He was not carrying a folder. I opened the door. He looked older than he had in the hospital. Or maybe I was seeing him differently now. There were lines in his face I hadn't noticed before, or hadn't let myself notice. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well, which gave me a complicated set of feelings that I was not going to let myself indulge in right then. "Nathan," I said. "Mom, can I come in?" I thought about it for one beat. Then I stepped back from the door. He came in. He stood in my front hallway and looked around at the house the way people do when they're nervous and need something to look at, besides the person they've come to face. His eyes passed over the photos on the wall. Gerald and me, young, before the kids. The kids at various ages. Havenbrook in its early days, a photo of the farmhouse the week we got the keys. "Sit down," I said, and led him into the living room. We sat across from each other. I had my notebook on the end table beside me. I didn't make a point of it, but I didn't hide it either. Nathan leaned forward with his forearms on his knees, a posture I recognized as his approximation of openness, willing to engage, not defensive. He'd used it in arguments since he was a teenager. "I know about the legal challenge," I said, before he could start. "Victoria has been in contact with Garrett Paulson's office. I know you're claiming I wasn't competent when I executed the foundation transfer." He didn't flinch. "Mom, don't." My voice was quiet, but I meant it completely. "Don't do the thing where you explain why this is actually about my well-being. I've heard that version. I'm done with that version." He closed his mouth, opened it again, then closed it. And then something happened that I didn't expect. His shoulders came down. Not with defeat exactly, more like the collapse of something that had been held at tension for too long and had finally run out of the energy to stay rigid. He looked at his hands for a moment, and when he looked up, his face had something in it I hadn't seen there in years. "I've been telling myself it was about protecting you," he said. His voice was different, flatter, less curated. "That you were getting older and you weren't thinking clearly about what would happen to Havenbrook without a plan. That I was the one being practical when everyone else was just—" He stopped. "The truth is, I don't know when protecting you turned into something else. I don't know when I stopped being able to tell the difference." I looked at my son. I looked at the tired lines in his face and the slumped posture and the hands that weren't quite still in his lap. I felt the pull of it, the old maternal gravity that wants to move toward pain, any pain, especially the pain of your children, and absorb it. But I had done that my entire life. I had absorbed it until I nearly had nothing left to give anything, including the 1,100 women who had walked through Havenbrook's doors needing something I had given to my own children first. "Nathan," I said carefully, "I believe that somewhere inside what you were doing, there was something that started as concern. I do believe that. But Garrett Paulson didn't write that legal challenge out of concern. Paul Sutter didn't have conversations about Havenbrook's development potential out of concern for me." I paused. "Olivia told me about that dinner." He went very still. "She told you," he said. Quiet. Not a question. "She did." A long silence. The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, someone drove past on the road. "Paul was just talking," Nathan said. "It wasn't a plan, it was just, he talks about everything in terms of development. I didn't take it seriously." "But you didn't stop him either." He looked at his hands again. "No." "And you didn't tell me." "No." "And then I got sick," I said. "And the thing you did, the first thing, the thing you organized, the thing you prepared in advance and brought to my hospital room, was a legal document that would have given you control of Havenbrook." I kept my voice even. I was not going to cry. I had decided that in the hospital, and I held to it now. "Nathan, you have to understand what that looked like, what that felt like, what it told me about everything that came before it." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I began to wonder if he was going to speak at all. "I know," he said finally. Do you know what Havenbrook is? I asked. Not what it's worth, not the acreage, not the zoning designation, what it actually is. He looked up at me. Your father bought that land with money we worked 30 years to save, I said. He bought it because he thought it should matter to someone. And after he died, I spent 4 years figuring out what that meant. I built that place from nothing but grief and stubbornness and the knowledge that I had to make something out of losing him, or I wasn't going to make it at all. My voice did something small and unwanted then, a slight change in texture that I controlled before it became more. That place is not an asset on a balance sheet. It is how I survived losing your father. It is how I survived all of it, and you were going to take it and sell it for land value. Nathan looked at me with an expression that was, I thought, probably as close to genuine regret as he was capable of in that moment. Not the practiced version. Something actual. I'm sorry, he said. I nodded once. But sorry isn't enough, I said, and I need you to know that, not because I want to punish you, because it's true. What you did created a legal challenge that is going to take time and money and energy to fight. What you did required me to document and protect myself against my own children. What you did, I stopped, chose the next words with care. What you did changed what I understand about our relationship, and I don't know yet what that means for the future. But I know it means something, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. He nodded. His jaw worked like he was trying to say something and hadn't found it yet. What do you need from me? He asked. I need you to withdraw the legal challenge. A pause. Okay. Today. Not next week. I need Victoria to have Paulson's withdrawal in writing before the end of the business week. Okay, he said again. I'll call him when I leave. And I need you to have no further contact with Paul Sutter about Havenbrook. Not conversations, not information sharing, not speculation, nothing. Okay? And Nathan, I looked at him directly, held his eyes until he held mine back. I need you to understand that Havenbrook is never going to be yours. Not in my lifetime. Not after my lifetime. The foundation transfer is permanent, it is legal, it is upheld, and no court is going to overturn it because the woman who executed it passed every competency assessment her physician administered 6 weeks before signing. It is done. Whatever you thought was going to happen, it is not going to happen. The room was quiet. Nathan straightened slightly, looked at his hands one more time, then back at me. I understand, he said. Do you? I asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He thought about it for a moment, which was more than I expected. I think I'm starting to, he said. He left 20 minutes later with a promise to call Paulson and a look on his face that was difficult to interpret and that I was not going to spend too much energy trying to interpret. I had learned in the last 2 weeks the cost of spending too much energy trying to understand my children's interior lives at the expense of protecting my own. He called Paulson. I knew because Victoria texted me at 4:45 that afternoon. Withdrawal notice received. We're clear. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a minute in the quiet of my kitchen, the kitchen where I had collapsed, where this had all begun, and I let myself feel the relief of that small thing. Withdrawal notice received. We're clear. But clear was relative, and I had not forgotten Olivia. Olivia called the next morning. She had heard from Nathan. I had expected that. They talked more than either of them ever admitted to me. And she led the call with an apology that was more genuine than I'd expected and less complete than it needed to be. She was sorry for the hospital. She was sorry for going along with Nathan's plan. She was sorry for the things she had said in my ICU room about Havenbrook needing oversight. She was not, I noticed, sorry for decades of calling when she needed things and going quiet when she didn't. She was not sorry for the money that had moved from my account to hers over the years without much ceremony of thanks. She was not sorry for the ways she had learned to make me feel guilty as a management strategy. Those sorries would have required her to look at a longer history than she was ready for. I understood that. It didn't make it less true. Olivia, I said when she had finished, I want to ask you something. Okay, she said carefully. When you came to the hospital, and you stood by that window, and you let Nathan do the talking, why didn't you say anything? A pause. I didn't think. I know what you didn't think. I'm asking why. Another pause, longer. Because it was easier, she said quietly. Because saying something would have meant disagreeing with Nathan, and disagreeing with Nathan has always been, it takes a lot. He doesn't fight fair. He doesn't get loud. She exhaled. He makes you feel like the problem, like you're the unreasonable one. And it's easier to just go along and tell yourself you're not really part of it. But you were part of it, I said. I know. You were standing in my hospital room, I said. You were there. Your presence was part of what they were using. Look, Mom, all three of your children think this is the right thing. You're the only one who doesn't see it. I paused. Your silence was as much a part of the pressure as the paperwork. I heard her breathing on the other end of the line. I know, she said again. I'm not going to tell you what to do about your relationship with your brother, I said. That's yours to figure out. But I need you to know that when you choose the easy thing, when you go along with something because disagreement is costly, the cost doesn't disappear. It just gets transferred, and for a long time it's been transferred to me. A silence that lasted long enough to be significant. I hear you, Olivia said. Good, I said. We talked for a while longer, carefully, both of us navigating something that had not been named yet but was very much present. Not a resolution, nothing so tidy, just two people who had a complicated history trying to speak honestly about part of it, which is harder than it sounds and worth more than most people give it credit for. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee and thought about the word complicated. I had been using it for years to describe my children. Complicated. Complex. Difficult to read. All the diplomatic language of a mother who loved her children and also, in some private part of herself, found them exhausting. They were not complicated. I could see that now with the particular clarity that comes from being scared and sick and forced to look at things directly. Nathan was a man who valued control and acquisition above nearly everything else, and who had spent years performing the emotion of family without fully feeling it. Olivia was a woman who had never learned to act on her own values when it was uncomfortable, and who had made that a lifestyle. Sophie was someone whose natural goodness kept getting swamped by her inability to hold a position when someone pushed back. These were not complicated people. They were recognizable people. The complications were mine, the stories I had told myself about them, the interpretations I had maintained because the alternative was too painful to hold. Sophie came to the house on Saturday. She came alone and she knocked too lightly, the way she always did, as if she was apologizing for being there before she even got inside. I opened the door and she looked at me and immediately began to cry. Not the arranged grief of Olivia in the hospital, but the real kind. The kind that starts somewhere behind the eyes and arrives before the person is ready for it. Mom, she said. That was all. Just my name. Come in, Sophie, I said. She sat at my kitchen table and I made tea I didn't particularly want because making tea gave us both something to do with the first few minutes, and she cried on and off while I moved around the kitchen and didn't tell her to stop. Crying was honest. I had more respect for it than I used to. When the tea was ready and the worst of the crying had passed, she wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been carrying something they're not sure they're allowed to put down. I should have said something in the hospital, she said. When Nathan put that folder on the bed, I should have said something right then. Yes, I said. You should have. She flinched slightly. I think she had expected some softening of that, some maternal cushion. Sophie, you have a good heart, I said. You always have. But a good heart that stays quiet when it matters is only useful to the people who are speaking. I needed you in that room, not agreeing with Nathan, not pretending you weren't there. I needed my daughter. I know, she said. Her voice was small. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, I said. I'm telling you because you're going to be in situations for the rest of your life where the easy thing and the right thing are not the same, and your heart knows the difference. The question is whether you'll listen to it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at me with an expression I recognized, the one she'd had as a child when she was trying to decide whether to be honest about something. Are you going to forgive Nathan? She asked. I thought about it, genuinely. I don't know, I said. I think that depends on what Nathan does next. Forgiving someone isn't a decision you make once, and then you're done. It's something that happens over time, and it requires the other person to actually change, not just to feel bad. I looked at my daughter. Do you understand the difference? I think so, she said. The fact that he feels guilty doesn't give him a clean slate. The fact that he withdrew the legal challenge is a start, Not a finish. He doesn't get credit for stopping a fire he lit. I paused. And neither do you, for that matter. You don't get credit just for being sorry. Credit comes from what you do after. Sophie nodded. Her eyes were wet again, but she wasn't crying anymore. What can I do? She asked. After, to actually help. I looked at my youngest child for a long moment, thought about the question, thought about what I actually needed, which was something I had not been very practiced at identifying over the past several decades. I need someone who will tell me the truth, I said. Not what I want to hear, not the comfortable version. If something is happening that I need to know about, with Nathan, with anything, I need someone who will call me and say it plainly. Can you do that? She met my eyes, steadier than I expected. Yes, she said, even when it's difficult? Yes, she said again. I nodded. I believed her. Not completely. Sophie had been letting things slide her whole life, and one conversation in my kitchen over tea wasn't going to restructure that, but I believed she meant it in that moment, which was a place to start. She stayed for 2 hours. We talked about things that weren't the hospital, or Nathan, or the legal challenge. She told me about a ceramics class she had started taking, which made sense because Sophie had always needed her hands in something. I told her about the board meeting I had scheduled at Havenbrook, what I was planning to present, how I was thinking about the sanctuary's next 5 years. She listened with genuine attention, which she had always been capable of when Nathan wasn't in the room directing traffic. When she left, she hugged me in the doorway the way she had as a child. Fully, without reservation, the hug of someone who isn't thinking about how it looks. I watched her get in her car and drive away. Then I went back to my desk. Because the work wasn't finished and I wasn't foolish enough to believe that 2 good conversations and a legal withdrawal notice meant the crisis was over. My children had tried to take something from me. They had entered my home without permission. They had filed a legal challenge to my competency. They had been in conversations about redeveloping land that belonged to 1,100 women who had needed somewhere to go. I had won a battle, not the war. And there was still something I hadn't addressed, something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the conversation with Victoria about next steps. Something beyond protecting what I had already built. Something about what came next, what Havenbrook needed to become in order to be truly beyond the reach of anyone who might, in the future, try to claim it. Something that was bigger than my family. Something that had to do with making the sanctuary not just legally protected but structurally unbreakable, in a way that my children and every Garrett Paulson in the world would eventually run out of angles to attack. I pulled out a fresh page in my notebook, and I started planning. The fresh page in my notebook stayed blank for about 3 minutes before I started writing on it. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I was trying to figure out the right order to say it in. Planning, real planning, requires a kind of brutal honesty about where you actually are before you can figure out where you're going. And where I actually was on that Saturday evening after Sophie drove away was this. The legal challenge had been withdrawn. The most immediate crisis had passed, but I was still a 72-year-old woman with a compromised heart, living alone in a house that my children had accessed without permission, and the organization I had spent more than a decade building was still, in certain technical ways, vulnerable to the kind of sustained legal pressure that money and a motivated attorney could generate. Nathan had withdrawn. But withdrawal wasn't the same as defeat, and I knew my son well enough to know that defeated wasn't a state he inhabited comfortably or for long. I wrote at the top of the page, "What does unbreakable look like?" And I started answering that question. The Havenbrook board meeting was on a Tuesday. I drove myself. Walter Bream met me in the parking lot, not because I had asked him to, but because Walter was the kind of person who understood what showing up physically communicated. And he had decided, apparently, that it communicated something important here. He was 76, former circuit court judge, with white hair and the permanently measured expression of a man who had spent decades listening to people tell him versions of events and learning to identify the gap between the version and the truth. "Clara," he said. "Walter." We shook hands in the cold October air, and then we went inside. There were 7 board members in total. 5 were present in person, 2 joined by phone. I knew all of them. I had recruited every one of them over the years for exactly the qualities they brought to this table. Walter for his legal precision, Diane Soto for her background in nonprofit finance, Reverend Marcus Webb, No, I am not going to use his title because this story doesn't involve anyone's faith, but the man himself was present, and his background was community organizing, which mattered for different reasons. Carol Amberson, who ran the County Social Services Network. James Fife, a retired hospital administrator. And on the phone, Patricia Nguyen from Portland, a women's rights attorney, and Greg Hollis, who managed the foundation's investment accounts. These were not decorative board members. These were people who had argued with me over budget decisions, who had pushed back on my programming ideas when they thought I was wrong, who had asked hard questions about staffing and impact measurement and long-term financial sustainability. I had not built a rubber stamp board. I had built an actual governance structure. I told them everything. I told them about the hospital, the power of attorney attempt, Nathan's contacts with Garrett Paulson, Olivia's disclosure about the dinner with Paul Sutter, the search of my home office, the competency challenge and its withdrawal, all of it, in order, as precisely as I could reconstruct it. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Walter said, "What do you need from us?" "Two things," I said. "First, I need the board to formally document that it has been informed of this situation and that it affirms the validity of the foundation structure and transfer. That documentation becomes part of our permanent record and creates a governance trail that makes any future legal challenge significantly harder to sustain." "Done," said Diane. "I'll draft the resolution today." "Second," I said, "I want to discuss the endowment." This got a different kind of attention, subtle shifts in posture around the table. The two voices on the phone went quieter in the particular way that people go quiet when they're listening harder. I had been thinking about the endowment since my conversation with Victoria. Havenbrook had an operational endowment, a modest one, built from years of careful fundraising and a few significant donations. It was enough to keep the sanctuary running for approximately 18 months if all external funding dried up simultaneously, which it never did, but the cushion existed. What I wanted to do was something more than that. "I want to establish a permanent endowment fund," I said, "large enough to sustain Havenbrook's operations for a minimum of 5 years without external fundraising dependence. I want that fund to be held by a third-party trustee, not the foundation itself, not any individual board member, with a governance structure that requires unanimous board approval plus independent legal review to access the principal for anything other than designated operational purposes." James Fife leaned forward. "Clara, that kind of endowment would require—" "I know what it would require," I said. "I've spent the last 4 days calculating it, and I have a proposal for how to seed it." I had spent those 4 days doing something I had been putting off for 2 years, cataloging the assets Gerald and I had accumulated over our marriage that were still held in my personal name. The house in Millhaven, a small investment account that Gerald had started and I had added to intermittently for decades, a parcel of farmland 3 miles outside town that we had bought as an investment in our 40s and had been leasing to a local farmer ever since. I was not going to give all of it to Havenbrook. I was not going to impoverish myself in my old age in the name of the organization. I had learned, finally, that martyrdom was not the same as generosity, and that depleting yourself entirely helped no one. But the farmland, the 3 acres that I had never had a particular plan for, that generated a modest lease income I barely noticed and mostly left sitting, that had a value that could meaningfully anchor an endowment. I had already called a commercial real estate assessor. I had the number. "I'm proposing to contribute the Kellner Road property to the endowment as the founding asset," I said. "Based on current market assessment, it represents a foundation of approximately $430,000. Combined with the existing endowment balance and a formal fundraising campaign targeting the endowment specifically, I believe we can reach a 5-year operational cushion within 18 months." Walter was watching me with an expression I recognized. The expression of a person who is deciding whether what they're seeing is what they think it is. "Clara," he said quietly, "you're using your personal assets to bulletproof the foundation against your own children." "I'm using assets I've been meaning to put to better use for years," I said. "The timing is what it is." He looked at me for another moment. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but in that direction. "Let's vote," he said. The vote was unanimous. The 2 board members on the phone didn't even pause. I drove home from that meeting feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not relief exactly. Something with more spine to it than relief. like the feeling of checking something off a list that you've been carrying for so long you forgot it was on there. It lasted until I got home and found a car I didn't recognize parked at the end of my driveway. I sat in my own car for a moment, looking at it. A silver sedan, Oregon plates, no one visible inside. It could have been nothing, a neighbor's visitor, someone turned around in the road. But I had developed, over the last 3 weeks, a very low threshold for anything that felt unusual near my house. I got out. I walked to my front porch. I was halfway up the steps when I heard footsteps on the side path and turned to find a man I had never seen before coming around the corner of the house. He was somewhere in his late 40s, well-dressed in the particular way of someone who works in business but is trying to seem casual, with the slightly too easy smile of a person who leads with charm as a professional strategy. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. "Who are you?" I said. "Paul Sutter." He extended his hand. "I'm Denise's brother, Nathan's brother-in-law. I've been hoping to have a chance to—" "How did you get into my backyard?" I said. He paused. The easy smile adjusted slightly. "The gate was open. I knocked at the front and—" "The gate was not open," I said. "I closed it yesterday and I haven't been out back since." I looked at him steadily. "What are you doing at my house, Mr. Sutter?" He recalibrated. The charm dialed back, something more businesslike came forward. "I wanted to introduce myself. I know things have been tense with the family, and I thought maybe if we could just have a conversation. No lawyers, no paperwork." "No," I said. He blinked. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you'd just—" "I'm going to say this once," I said. "You have been in conversations about Havenbrook Sanctuary's property value and development potential. You accessed, or someone you arranged to access, my private property without permission, and now you are standing in my yard, unannounced, having entered through a gate that was not open." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling Victoria Hayes right now, and if you're not in your car and off my property in the next 60 seconds, I'm calling the non-emergency police line after that." He looked at me for a long moment. The charm was fully gone now. There was something harder underneath it, and I noted that too, filed it, because it confirmed something I had suspected about Paul Sutter, that his easy smile had been designed to obscure. "You're making a mistake," he said. Nathan wants to work this out with you. There are real options here that you're not even—" 50 seconds, I said. He left. I stood on my porch and watched the silver sedan reverse down my driveway and pull out onto the road. My hands were not entirely steady. I noted that too. Allowed it, because my hands had a right to not be steady after a man I didn't know appeared in my backyard unannounced to talk to me about property I had legally protected. I called Victoria. Not from fear. I was past the fear stage, but because I had learned that every incident needed to be documented and she needed to know. "Paul Sutter came to my house," I told her. "He entered my backyard through a gate he claims was open, which it wasn't. He said Nathan wants to work things out. I told him to leave." A pause. "He came to your home in person?" "Yes." "Did he threaten you?" "Not explicitly. He said I was making a mistake. He said there were real options I wasn't considering." Another pause, longer. "Clara, I need to be honest with you. The withdrawal of the legal challenge was a tactical step, not a surrender. Nathan has been quiet since that call, which in my experience means he's not done. He's regrouping. Sending Sutter to your house, unannounced, to have a casual conversation about options. That's not a casual gesture. That's information gathering. He wanted to see where you are, how firm you are, whether there's a version of you that might be worn down enough to negotiate." "There isn't," I said. "I know that," Victoria said. "But he doesn't know that yet, apparently." She paused. "I want to move on the guardianship prevention filing. I had been expecting this. We had discussed it in the hospital, the legal mechanism that would formally place on record my competency, my current medical status, my clearly documented capacity for independent decision-making, and my explicit rejection of any family-initiated guardianship proceeding. It was a preemptive filing, a way of laying down a legal marker before the challenge came, rather than scrambling to respond after. "Do it," I said. "It means formal documentation of your medical situation going into the public record. I know what it means. People will know you had a cardiac event, that you're managing a chronic condition. People already know," I said. "My children know. Garrett Paulson knows. Anyone Paul Sutter has talked to knows. The only person the privacy is protecting at this point is Nathan, and I'm done protecting Nathan. All right, Victoria said. I'll file Monday. The filing went in Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Nathan called. I let it go to voicemail. I had not planned to, exactly. I hadn't made a conscious decision about whether to answer or not. But when his name appeared on the screen, some part of me made the decision before I could think it through, and I watched the call ring out and then sat quietly while the voicemail notification appeared. I listened to the message once. His voice was controlled. Not the rehearsed sincerity of the second hospital visit, not the tired honesty of the living room conversation. This was the real Nathan, the one I had heard in the hallway outside my ICU room. Even, precise, slightly clipped. A man who had received information he hadn't expected and was adjusting to it. Mom, I know you filed something with the court today. I need you to understand that I'm not going to fight you on this. I'm not. A pause. The kind of pause where someone is deciding what comes next. I just need you to know that I don't think this is over, and I don't think you and I are done talking about Havenbrook's future. Call me back when you're ready. I don't think this is over. I played the message a second time, not because I needed to hear it twice to understand it, but because I wanted to be sure I was hearing what was actually there rather than what I expected to be there. He was right that it wasn't over. That was the most honest thing in the message. I called him back the next morning. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting for it. Nathan, I said. Mom. A breath. Thanks for calling back. Your message said you don't think this is over, I said. Tell me what you mean by that. A pause. I mean, I think there's still a conversation to be had about Havenbrook's future. Not the property. Not development. I hear you on that. I understand it's done, and I'm not going back to Paulson. But the organization itself, what happens when you can't run it anymore? There's a board of directors for that purpose, I said. There's a succession plan that Lenore and I have been developing for 2 years. There's a governance structure that doesn't require me to be present and functioning to keep the organization stable. A succession plan that doesn't involve family, correct? He was quiet for a moment. That bothers me, he said. I know it does. Mom, Nathan, listen to me. I sat down at my kitchen table. Outside the window, the morning was pale gray, leaves collecting in the yard. You are my son. I love you. That is not the same as it has ever been, and it is not going to stop. But love is not a governance strategy. Love is not a management plan. Love is not a reason to put an organization built for the benefit of vulnerable women into the hands of someone whose primary association with it has been as a potential asset. I paused. The board has people on it who are qualified to lead Havenbrook into the future. You are not one of them. Not because I don't love you, but because loving you and trusting you with this are two entirely separate things, and you spent the last several months making sure I understood exactly why they were separate. A long silence. That's fair, he said, very quietly. It was the most surprising thing he had said to me in 3 weeks. Possibly longer. I know it's fair, I said. What I don't know is whether you actually believe it or whether you're saying it because you've run out of angles. Maybe both, he said. Mom, I'm not going to pretend I've become a different person. I'm still thinking about what Havenbrook is worth. I can't turn that off. But I also know that I handled this wrong, that I went about it in a way that was... He stopped. I've been thinking about Dad. That surprised me. I waited. He bought that land and he never... Nathan stopped again, started over. He never talked about what it was worth. He just talked about what it could be. And I spent my whole career doing the opposite. Everything is what it's worth. A pause. I don't know what to do with that right now, but I've been thinking about it. I sat with that for a moment. My son, 41 years old, sitting with the gap between his father and himself. I had room for that to matter to me, even now, even after everything. That's a start, I said, thinking about it. Yeah, he said. We hung up without resolution, which was accurate. There was no resolution. There was a man who had tried to take something from me and had failed, and who was now sitting with some version of himself that he didn't entirely recognize, and there was me, 72, compromised heart, notebook full of documentation, a foundation that was bulletproofed, and a board that was united, and a legal record that was clean and clear. It was not a tidy place to be, but it was real. 3 days after that call, I got a letter. Not an email. A letter, handwritten, in an envelope addressed to me in a handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Nathan's handwriting, the careful print he had developed as a teenager when his teachers complained that his cursive was illegible, the same print he had used on birthday cards, and the occasional holiday note, and nothing much else. I stood in my front hallway with the envelope in my hand for a full minute before I opened it. It was 2 pages. I am not going to reproduce it here because some things belong to the people they were written between and nowhere else. But I will tell you what it contained. It contained an acknowledgement. Not an apology exactly. Nathan did not come easily to apologies, and a practiced apology from him would have meant less than what he actually gave me. What he gave me was an acknowledgement of specific things. The dinner with Paul Sutter. The decision to bring Paulson in. Walking into my hospital room with legal papers. He named each thing specifically without softening or contextualizing it, he said, in words on paper, in his careful printed handwriting. I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway. And I told myself reasons why that were not the real reason. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in the lockbox with Gerald's birthday combination, where I kept the things that mattered. I didn't call him to acknowledge it. Not because I was punishing him, I was past the punishing stage, but because I didn't yet know what to say. Some things need to sit before you know what they are. What I did instead was call Lenora. Lenora Baptiste had been Havenbrook's program director for 4 years. She was 53, sharp and warm in equal measure, with the particular competence of someone who had come up hard and learned to build solid things because she understood what happened when the foundation wasn't solid. She had been running the sanctuary in my absence without complaint or drama, and doing it, by all accounts, extremely well. I want to schedule a formal succession planning session, I told her. Not hypothetical, actual. I want to start building out what leadership transition looks like. Timeline, structure, board involvement. I want to start putting it on paper. A pause on her end. Is this about your health? Are things... My health is what it is, I said. I'm managing. But the last several weeks have reminded me that I've been treating succession planning as a distant abstraction when it should be an active document. I'm 72. I have a board meeting in 3 weeks. I want to walk in there with a draft plan. Okay, Lenora said. She had the quality of moving quickly once a direction was established, which I valued enormously. I can put together a first draft by next Friday. We can meet Thursday the week after? Thursday works, I said. After I hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet of my kitchen. Through the window, the yard was bare and late-season gray, the rose bush stripped down, the oak in the corner of the fence holding its few remaining leaves with the particular stubbornness of things that have weathered enough to know the season isn't final. I thought about Gerald. I did that a lot those days, more than I had in years, actually. The crisis had brought him back to me in a strange way, not as a wound, but as a presence. As the person who had understood, without being able to articulate it, that the land mattered, that the things we built with our lives had meaning beyond the material value we assigned them. He had been a contractor. He had built things literally with his hands, and he had understood in his body what it meant to make something solid, something that could outlast the person who made it. I had spent 23 years trying to make Havenbrook solid in the same way, and I had spent the last 3 weeks learning just how solid it actually was. The guardianship prevention filing created a formal legal record that Nathan's attorney, a new attorney, not Paulson, someone he had apparently engaged briefly before abandoning that avenue, had reviewed and apparently advised was not worth challenging. Victoria called me on a Wednesday morning to tell me that she had received confirmation that no guardianship petition would be filed. It's over? I asked. The guardianship angle is over, she said. The foundation challenge is resolved. The only outstanding question is whether Sutter's presence on your property could be pursued as trespass or harassment. But frankly, with everything else settled, I don't think that fight is worth your energy unless it happens again. It won't happen again, I said. And I believed it. Paul Sutter had come to my house to find a soft target and had found something else. Men like Paul Sutter move on when a target stops being soft. Then I think we're in a position where the immediate threats have been addressed, Victoria said. What's next for you? It was a practical question. She meant it practically, but I sat with it for a moment as if it were larger than that, because it felt larger than that. The endowment campaign, I said. The succession planning. The East Wing expansion we've been deferring for 2 years. I want to look at that again. A pause. And I want to do something I've been putting off. What's that? I want to have a real conversation with the board about Havenbrook's long-term public identity. What it means in this community. What it could mean. I had been thinking about this since the board meeting, since the vote on the endowment, since Walter Bream had looked at me across the table and said what he said about bulletproofing. Right now, Havenbrook is valuable to the community because of the work it does. I want it to be visible in a way that makes it impossible to touch. I want it to be the kind of organization that the whole county knows and values and would fight to protect. You want community ownership, Victoria said. I want community identity, I corrected. There's a difference. The legal ownership is clean. I want the emotional ownership to match. A pause. That's a longer-term project. I'm planning for the long term, I said. I'm 72. My heart is imperfect. I don't know exactly how many years I'm planning for. But whatever the number is, I'd like to spend them on something that matters. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You know, Clara, when we started this process, when you first came to me about the foundation restructuring, I thought it was about protection, defensive legal positioning. I didn't fully understand until later that it was also about something else. What do you think it was about? I asked, curious. Love, she said simply. Just a different kind than your children had in mind. I thought about that after we hung. Thought about the word love in the context of legal documents and board resolutions and endowment funds and succession plans. It seemed like an unlikely place for love to live. But then, love has always lived in unlikely places. In kitchens and parking lots and hospital rooms, in phone calls and handwritten letters and decisions that take 4 years to become real. In a piece of land beside a creek, purchased by a man who couldn't say exactly why, who only knew it should matter to someone. The Tuesday evening group met the following week. Marianne had kept it running in my absence, and she came with me the first Tuesday I was back, and sat in the back corner of the community room and let me do the work. There were 8 women in the circle that evening. I knew 3 of them from before my hospitalization. The other 5 were new to Havenbrook, new to this room, in various stages of the particular exhaustion that brings someone to a place like this. One of them was 26 years old and had arrived the previous week with 2 garbage bags of belongings and a broken wrist that was healing. One of them was 61 and had been in her marriage for 38 years and had finally left and wasn't sure yet what that meant about who she was now. We sat in a circle, the way we always did. I looked around at these 8 women and I thought about Nathan in my living room, his hands in his lap, talking about what his father would have seen in the land. I thought about Paul Sutter in my backyard with his easy smile and his property assessments. I thought about Garrett Paulson and his competency challenge and the particular arrogance of assuming that a woman's life could be reduced to a question of capacity. And then I stopped thinking about all of that because these 8 women were in front of me and they were real and they were here. Let's start, I said, with however you're feeling right now. Just honestly, no right answer. The woman who had arrived with the garbage bags looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked up. Tired, she said. I know, I said. That's a good place to start. Because it was. Tired was real. Tired was where you were before you figured out what came next. I had been tired. I was still tired in the way that people who have been through something significant carry the weight of it in their body long after the acute crisis has passed. But tired was not finished. I had learned that, or relearned it, in a hospital bed 11 days ago. And I was sitting in this room on this Tuesday evening because I had learned it, because this room and these 8 women, and the 8 rooms upstairs, and the garden, and the lake with its hissing ducks, and the creek along the back edge of Gerald's land. This was what came after tired. This was what came after everything. And nobody, not Nathan, not Garrett Paulson, not Paul Sutter with his development projections, was going to take it. The circle held. We talked for 2 hours. And then, outside the community room windows, the evening came down fully dark, and the lights inside the sanctuary made the windows gold. And I sat in that warmth and thought that Gerald had been right about the land, and I had been right about what to do with it, and that some things, once you build them solid enough, simply refuse to fall. I drove home that night on the same roads I had driven 1,000 times, in the dark, with the heater running and the radio off. When I pulled into my driveway and cut the engine, I sat in the quiet for a moment. Inside the house, on the end table by my chair, was my notebook, full of dates and times and documentation and the specific cold record of what my children had tried to do. On the desk in my office, in a folder labeled simply Next, was the draft succession plan I was meeting Lenora about on Thursday. In the lockbox with Gerald's birthday, 2 pages of Nathan's careful print handwriting sat folded between the foundation transfer documents. I gathered all of it, together, and I held it for a moment as a whole rather than as separate pieces. Then I got out of the car and went inside. The succession planning meeting with Lenora happened on a Thursday afternoon in early November, 3 weeks after I came home from the hospital, and it lasted 4 hours. I want to tell you about that meeting because it was, in its quiet and entirely undramatic way, one of the most important things that happened in all of this. Not the legal filings, not the board resolution, not Nathan's letter in the lockbox, though all of those mattered. The meeting with Lenora mattered in a different register. It mattered the way things matter when you stop doing them for someone else and start doing them because they are simply the right thing, because the work deserves it, because you finally understand that protecting something properly means planning for the version of the future where you are no longer in it. Lenora had prepared a draft, 41 pages, organized into sections covering governance transition, program leadership, financial oversight, community relationships, and what she called organizational memory, the institutional knowledge that lives in people's heads and tends to disappear when those people leave. She had done this in 3 weeks, while simultaneously running the sanctuary's daily operations. And it was thorough in a way that made me feel 2 things at once, proud and quietly humbled. "This is excellent work," I told her, when I had read through the first section. "It needed to exist," she said simply. "We should have done this 2 years ago." "I know," I said. "I kept treating it like something we'd get to." "You were busy running the place." "That's not a good enough reason," I said. "An organization that can only function with a specific person at the center is an organization that's one bad diagnosis away from chaos." I knew that. I just didn't want to sit down and think about what it meant about my own replaceability. Lenora looked at me across the table with the direct, unbothered gaze she had. "You're not replaceable," she said, "but the work is continuable. Those are different." I wrote that down. Not in my documentation notebook. In a different one I had started after the hospital, smaller, where I put things I wanted to keep for different reasons. Things that clarified rather than recorded. We worked through the draft section by section. We talked about timeline, not because I expected to step down imminently, but because a transition plan without a timeline is just a list of intentions. We talked about Lenora's role in an eventual leadership structure, which she approached with the same careful honesty she brought to everything. She was willing to lead, she said, but she wanted the board's full support and a co-director model rather than a single-person structure, because she had seen what happened to organizations where everything ran through one person. "You built something that runs on your strength," she told me. "I want to build something that runs on structure. Both are valid, but structure outlasts people." "I know," I said. By the end of 4 hours, we had a working document that I was genuinely proud of. Not because it was mine, because it was Havenbrook's, because it belonged to the work, not to any one person's vision or any one family's expectations. I drove home that evening in the dark, again on those familiar roads, and I thought about what Lenora had said. Structure outlasts people. And I thought about Nathan's letter in the lockbox, and about Olivia's phone call, and about Sophie sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and I thought about what structure meant in the context of a family. Families don't have governance documents. They don't have succession plans. They run on something messier and less reliable and more powerful than any board resolution. They run on love and history and the particular gravity of people who have been in each other's lives since the beginning. And that gravity doesn't disappear just because trust has been broken. It just becomes more complicated to navigate. I had been navigating it for 3 weeks. I was still navigating it. The month of November moved the way late autumn moves in that part of Oregon, heavy and gray and punctuated by days of such startling clarity that they almost hurt to look at. I went to my follow-up appointments with Dr. Ellison, who told me at the second one that my progress was better than he had initially projected, which was his careful way of saying I was doing well without committing to anything optimistic enough to be held to. I took my medication. I walked, carefully, the distances Dr. Ellison approved, along the road in front of my house where the neighbors' dogs knew me by sight and barked at me anyway out of professional obligation. I went to Havenbrook 3 times a week. I sat in on sessions when they wanted me and stayed out of them when they didn't. I met with Rosa about administrative things, and with the counseling staff about program things, and with Lenora about the succession document, which was developing into something genuinely solid. And I thought about my children. I thought about them the way you think about a fracture that is healing, aware of it, taking it into account, not putting too much weight on it until it has had time to knit. Nathan called twice in November. Once to ask how I was feeling, a conversation that lasted 10 minutes and was careful and slightly formal in a way that felt honest rather than cold. We were both figuring out where the new lines were, which takes time, and the care we were taking with it was, I thought, more respectful than pretending nothing had happened. The second time he called because Denise had been diagnosed with a thyroid condition, nothing serious but requiring monitoring and some adjustment, and he called to tell me, which surprised me. Not the news itself, but that he called to tell me, that he thought I was someone to tell. I said I was sorry, and asked how Denise was managing, and he said she was fine, annoyed by the medication adjustment, but fine. And there was something in that short, ordinary call that was more like what I had wanted from my son for years than any of the elaborate performances of care he had offered before. Something small and real. Olivia sent an email in mid-November, such not a long one. Olivia was not a person who wrote long emails. She preferred the phone for things that mattered and emails for things that didn't, and this one occupied a strange middle territory. She said she had been thinking. She said she had started seeing a therapist, which she offered without fanfare or expectation of a response, just as a fact about her life. She said she wasn't sure what she was working toward, but she was working. I wrote back and said I was glad, that I meant it, that the door was open when she was ready. I did not say the door was open the way it had always been, because it wasn't. The door that had always been open had been the door of a woman who absorbed everything, who translated her children's pain into something manageable before handing it back to them. Lighter and cleaner, who paid emotional tolls that nobody counted because she paid them so regularly they stopped looking like costs. That door was not open anymore. The door that was open now was different. It required something from the person walking through it. It required honesty and some evidence of change, and the willingness to be in a relationship where both people's needs existed simultaneously. Olivia's email suggested she might be moving slowly in that direction. I was not going to rush her, and I was not going to pretend the movement was further along than it was. But I saw it. I noted it. Sophie called every Sunday, not because I had asked her to. She had started doing it the week after our kitchen table conversation and had not stopped. She called on Sunday mornings while she was having her coffee, and we talked about ordinary things, and occasionally she told me something that mattered, something happening with Olivia, something she had noticed about Nathan, something she was thinking about in her own life. She was practicing, I thought, the thing I had asked her to practice, saying the real thing even when the easy thing was available. She wasn't perfect at it. She still softened things sometimes, still hedged when a direct statement would have served better. But she was trying. And trying, when it comes from someone who has spent their whole life avoiding difficulty, is worth something significant. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Nathan called again. I want to ask you something, he said. His voice had the particular texture of someone who has rehearsed an opening and is now trying to sound like they haven't. Ask, I said. Would you come to Thanksgiving? At our house, just the family. Olivia is flying in. Sophie is driving up. Denise wants... He stopped. Started differently. I want you there. Not as a gesture, not as some kind of, I just want my mother at Thanksgiving. I sat with that for a moment. My kitchen was warm and smelled of the soup I had been making, and outside the November rain was coming down in the particular way it does in that part of the world, gray and patient and committed. Nathan, I said carefully, I want to be honest with you about what I can bring to that table. Okay. I can come. I am willing to come. But I am not coming as the person who pretends the last 2 months didn't happen, who makes everyone comfortable by acting as though things are fine when they're still in process. That's not what I'm able to do anymore. If I come as who I actually am right now. Someone who is still figuring out what this family looks like going forward, who loves all of you and is also still hurt, and who is not going to perform normalcy because it makes dinner easier. A pause. That's all I want, Nathan said. I'm not asking for performance. He exhaled. I miss you. Is that allowed? Something moved through me at that. Not the clean, warm thing it would have been before. Something more complicated, with friction in it, which was actually more real. Yes, I said. That's allowed. Will you come? Yes, I said. I'll come. Thanksgiving at Nathan and Denise's house was not the worst version of itself, and it was not the best version either. It was something true, which is rarer and harder, and ultimately more worth having than either of those. Denise made a turkey that was better than the dry one I remembered from 2 years ago. She had brined it this time, and it showed. And there were too many side dishes in the way of holiday meals where everyone brings something and coordination fails gloriously. Nathan's daughters, my granddaughters, Emma and Claire, were 9 and 12 now, and they pulled me into their lives with the uncomplicated directness of children who have not yet learned to perform their feelings, which I found deeply restoring. Olivia arrived looking different than I had seen her in years. Not physically different, but with something less defended in her face, something that might have been the early evidence of the therapy she had mentioned. We hugged in the front hallway, and she held on for a moment longer than the polite version of a hug, and I held on too, and neither of us said anything, because there are things that don't need words and things that aren't ready for them yet, and this was both. Sophie was already there when I arrived, in the kitchen with Denise, the two of them talking in the easy way of people who don't need to perform ease because they've always had it, and she looked up when I walked in and smiled the real smile, the one from childhood, the one that hadn't changed. We sat down to dinner at 2 o'clock. Nathan sat at the head of the table, the way he always did, the way Gerald used to do. I sat across from Emma and Claire. Olivia was to my left. Sophie was at the far end, gesturing at something with her fork and making Claire laugh. Nathan stood to do the thing he always did at Thanksgiving. The brief acknowledgement before eating, the family ritual that Gerald had started and that Nathan had maintained, though his version was always more clipped and slightly more self-conscious than Gerald's had been. He stood, and he looked around the table, and then he looked at me. I'm grateful you're here, Mom, he said. Not as a preamble to something else, not as a performance, just that directly, to me, across the table, in front of his daughters and his wife and his sisters. I nodded once. I'm glad to be here, I said. And I meant it. Imperfectly, with the full weight of the last 2 months underneath it, with the fracture still healing and the new line still being drawn. I meant it. We ate. The food was good. Emma told me at length about a book she was reading about ocean ecosystems, which she had apparently become passionate about with the total commitment of a 9-year-old who has discovered something that matters. I listened with genuine attention because ocean ecosystems are genuinely interesting, and because Emma at 9 was building exactly the kind of relationship with the world that I hoped she would maintain when it got harder. After dinner, Nathan and I ended up on the back porch together. Not planned. He came out for air and I came out because the house had gotten warm, and we stood side by side at the railing looking out at the backyard. The bare November garden, the kids' old play structure that nobody had gotten around to taking down, the fence line going gray with weather. I told Paul Sutter I was done, Nathan said after a while. Done with? Any conversation about Havenbrook, any conversation about your property, any conversation about development opportunities in Mill Haven. He was looking at the fence line. I also told him I didn't want him at Christmas. I didn't say anything for a moment. The rain had stopped, but the air still held the cold, wet smell of it. How did he take that? I asked. About how you'd expect. He said I was being irrational, that it was just business talk, that nothing had ever been formal or planned, that I was overreacting. Nathan paused. He's not entirely wrong that nothing was ever formally planned, but he's wrong that it was nothing. What do you think it was? He was quiet for a moment. I think I let myself get into a conversation I should have shut down, and I let it continue because somewhere in the back of my mind, I wasn't shutting the door on it. He turned slightly toward me. That's the honest version. I know, I said, That's the version I needed to hear. We stood in the cold a little longer. Inside, through the kitchen window, I could see Sophie drying dishes and Denise passing her things, and the ordinary domestic warmth of it was something I let myself feel without pulling back from it. Dad would have hated what I did, Nathan said. It was the first time he had said it plainly, without softening, without context. Yes, I said. He would have. He wasn't perfect either, Nathan said. It wasn't defensive. He said it the way you say a true thing that complicates a simpler true thing. He wasn't always easy. He had a temper. He wasn't great at apologizing. No, I said. He wasn't. But he never... Nathan stopped. He never thought about things in terms of what they were worth to him. That wasn't how he operated. And I've spent my whole career thinking that way, and I thought it was just practical, smart, and maybe it is, in some contexts. But I looked at something he built, that you built, and I put a number on it. He paused. I've been sitting with that. I looked at my son, the lines in his face, the gray coming into his hair that I had noticed at the hospital and not mentioned, the way he held his hands on the railing in a way that was so much like his father's posture that it had been breaking my heart quietly for years. He was not a good man who had done a bad thing. He was a complicated man who had made choices that revealed what he had been building inside himself, quietly, for years. Those were different situations and required different responses. Nathan, I said, I'm not going to tell you that we're fine. We're not fine yet. But I'm going to tell you that I think we're going to be something, not the same thing we were before, something different. And I don't know yet if different is better or just changed, but I'm willing to find out. He looked at me. Something moved across his face that wasn't easily named. That's more than I expected, he said. I know, I said. We went back inside. The months that followed were not a straight line. Nothing real ever is. There were weeks in December and January where Nathan and I didn't speak, not because of new conflict, but because the old one was still settling, and sometimes the most honest thing is distance until you have something worth saying. There were weeks where Olivia and I had phone calls that felt like progress, and weeks where she went quiet, and I didn't chase her, because I had learned, finally, that chasing people who weren't ready was a form of taking their agency away, even when the chasing came from love, maybe especially then. Sophie continued her Sunday calls. She told me in February that she had started seeing someone, a woman named Dara, a school teacher, who Sophie described with a careful restraint that I recognized as the restraint of someone who is happy and is afraid that saying so will make the happy thing fragile. I told her I was glad. I told her I wanted to meet Dara. Sophie laughed in the relieved way of someone who hadn't been sure how a thing would land and said she would arrange it, and I felt something warm and uncomplicated in the middle of all the complicated things. Havenbrook held its spring fundraiser in March. It was the first major public event since my hospitalization, and Lenora and Rosa and the whole staff had put it together with a level of organization that made clear, if it hadn't been clear before, that this place did not require me to function. I sat at a table near the back of the community room and watched people who had heard about Havenbrook, who had supported it over the years, who had been touched by it in ways I knew about and in ways I would never know about, move through the room together. Walter Bream sat next to me for part of the evening. We talked, without planning to, about legacy, what it meant, what it cost, whether it was possible to build something that outlasted the desire for credit. Most people can't, he said. They want the thing to survive, but they also want it to keep looking like them. I know, I said. I had to give that up somewhere in the last 6 months. What did it feel like? I thought about it. Like putting something down that I didn't realize I'd been carrying, I said. Relief, mostly. And a little grief. He nodded. That's about right. The endowment campaign launched that spring, with the Kellner Road property transfer completed and documented, and a matching gift challenge from a donor who had been connected to Havenbrook for years. Within 4 months, we had raised enough to anchor the 5-year fund. Victoria filed the final paperwork in June, and when she called to tell me it was done, there was a quality to the silence after she said it that was very different from any silence I had inhabited in the preceding year. Done. Truly done. Not the crisis done of Nathan's withdrawal notice, but the structural done of something built to last. I sat in my kitchen and I let that settle into me for a few minutes. Then I called Marianne. It's done, I told her. She said, I know. I've been waiting for you to call. You knew before I called? Victoria may have mentioned it, she said, with the tone of someone who has been keeping a secret with some difficulty and is glad to be free of it. I laughed. An actual laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere you didn't expect it and isn't performing anything. Marianne laughed too. We talked for an hour. We talked about Havenbrook and about our children and about Gerald, because Marianne had known Gerald, and she understood what it meant to me that the land had become what it had become. We talked about what we were going to plant in her garden this summer and whether the new diner on Maple Street was actually good or just new. We talked about everything and nothing, the way people talk when they have 34 years between them and no agenda. When we hung up, I sat for a while longer. I want to tell you what I understand now that I did not understand before. Not because this is a story with lessons attached to the end, the way a fable has a moral in a box, but because I am 72 years old and I have been through something. And when you have been through something, you owe the people who sat with you through the telling of it, the truth of what you actually learned. I learned that love is not the same as ownership, that my children loved me in their ways, in the shapes available to them, and that their love was real and also entirely compatible with wanting to take things from me. Those two facts coexisted without resolving each other. The love was not a lie, but it was also not a protection. I learned that the most dangerous thing a person can do, the thing that costs the most over the longest time, is to keep interpreting what they see through the lens of what they hope. I had done that for decades with my children. I had taken what Nathan did and translated it into ambition. I had taken what Olivia did and translated it into pain. I had taken what Sophie did and translated it into softness. I had been so committed to the charitable interpretation that I had nearly given them what they were after. I learned that protecting yourself is not the opposite of love. That boundary is not a wall. It is a door with a handle on both sides. And that choosing who gets a key and when and on what terms is not cruelty. It is the most basic form of self-respect. I should have learned that at 30. I learned it at 72, in a hospital bed, with a legal document sliding across my blanket. Better late than not at all. I learned that age is not a debt you owe. That being 72 or 82, or any age at which your body has started requiring maintenance, that does not mean your voice becomes smaller. That does not mean your decisions become the property of the people who will outlive you. That does not mean your dignity is negotiable. The assumption that old age reduces personhood is so embedded in the way we treat elderly people, especially elderly women, that it operates invisibly, and you don't always see it until someone acts on it, until a son walks into an ICU room and slides a paper across the blanket and says, "Sign here, this is for your protection." It is not for your protection. It is never for your protection. Anyone who has to tell you something is for your protection, while handing you a legal document is not protecting you. I learned that grief, if you let it, will tell you what matters. Gerald's grief told me about that land. The land told me about those women. The women told me about what the world is actually made of when you strip away the calculations and the property values and the family entitlements. It is made of people who needed a place to go and found one, and that is worth more than anything Paul Sutter ever put a number on. And I learned, this is the last thing, the one I am still learning, that a life doesn't have to be finished to be full. That, at 72, with a compromised heart and a complicated family and a foundation board that no longer needs me at the center of it, I am not at the end of anything. I am in the middle of the version of my life that is most purely mine. The version that doesn't belong to Gerald's memory or my children's expectations or anyone's idea of who a woman my age should be. This is the version where I decide. The reopening celebration at Havenbrook happened in late September, nearly a year after I had collapsed on my kitchen floor. It wasn't officially called a reopening. It was called a community gathering, which was Lenora's term and more accurate. But it functioned as one, a formal reintroduction of the sanctuary to the wider community in its newly structured, newly endowed form. We set up tables on the grounds. The weather cooperated in the grudging way Oregon weather sometimes cooperates in late September. Overcast but dry, with moments of angled light through the oak trees that made everything look the way things look in photographs that turn out better than expected. Rosa had organized the food with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. The Tuesday evening group was there, current members and some former members who had driven distances I hadn't expected to get back for this. Former residents who had heard and come. Staff from the early years who I hadn't seen in half a decade. Lenora gave a speech that was clear and warm and precise and mentioned me in it in the way I had specifically requested, briefly, accurately, and without sanctifying me, because a living person being sanctified in their own presence is embarrassing and also inaccurate. Walter Bream said a few words about the foundation and the endowment in the dry, factual way of a man who trusts facts to carry emotional weight on their own. And then, at some point in the afternoon, I found myself walking the back path through the oaks, alone, the sounds of the gathering fading behind me as I went. I walked to the edge of the creek, Gerald's Creek, the one he had looked at when he bought this land and thought, this should matter to someone. The water was low and clear in the late September light, moving over the stones with the unhurried sound of water that has been moving over those stones for longer than any of us have been alive. The oaks were just beginning to turn. A heron was standing in the shallow bend downstream with the motionless patience of something that knows it has all the time in the world. I stood there for a while. I thought about what it had cost to be here. The years, the money, the grief, the stubbornness, the hospital, the notebook, the legal documents and the board meetings, and the 4-hour session with Lenora and the Thanksgiving dinner with the bird that was better than the one from 2 years ago. Nathan's letter in the lockbox. Olivia's email. Sophie's Sunday calls. Marianne's soup. I thought about all of it as a whole, the full shape of it, the way it looked from this side. And I thought, I would do it again. Not the betrayal. That I would have avoided if I could have, though I'm not sure I would have seen it coming because I didn't want to see it. But the building, the fighting, the refusing to sign, the decision to protect what mattered even when it meant going to war with people I loved. Yes, all of it. Because this is what I know, standing at this creek on this September afternoon with the heron downstream and the sound of 200 people gathered behind me on the grounds of the place I made from nothing but land and grief and stubbornness. A woman who has spent her whole life giving does not owe anyone the right to take what's left. She does not owe it to her children. She does not owe it to the people who have always assumed her softness was permission. She does not owe it to the culture that decided somewhere along the way that old age is a sentence and illness is a weakness, and a mother's love is a resource to be extracted. She owes it to herself to stand at the edge of something she built and say, I made this. It belongs to everyone now, and you will not take it. At 72, with a damaged heart and a complicated family and more life behind me than ahead, I stood at Gerald's Creek and I said that to the water and the heron and the oak trees and the September sky. Then I turned around and walked back through the trees toward the sound of the gathering, the talking and the laughter, and the particular sound of people who have been through hard things, finding themselves in a place that was made specifically to hold them. I walked back to my people. I walked back to my life. And not one single person in the world, not Nathan with his calculations, not Olivia with her managed grief, not Paul Sutter with his development projections, not Garrett Paulson with his competency challenges. Not one of them had any power over what that felt like. That was mine. It was always mine. I just had to fight hard enough to remember it. To you, watching this, wherever you are, whatever city or country you're seeing this from, I want to say something directly. If there is someone in your life who is trying to convince you that your age makes you less, that your illness makes you smaller, that the love you have given over a lifetime somehow means you owe them the right to decide what happens to what remains of you. I want you to hear what Clara Whitmore learned at 72 years old on the floor of her kitchen and the bed of an ICU and the edge of a creek on her dead husband's land. You are allowed to protect what is yours. You're allowed to say no to the people you love. You're allowed to build something and then build a wall around it and say, this is not for taking. Love does not require surrender, and it is never too late. Not at 72, not at 82, not in any hospital bed, not in any season of your life, to choose yourself. That is the end of Clara's story, and the beginning of her next chapter.